The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Kensington Palace as Prince William stood by the large windows of his private study. His hands were clasped behind his back, a familiar pose that his staff had come to recognize as a sign of deep contemplation. Today was different from any other day in his royal duties. Today he would have to say goodbye to someone who had been more than just a mentor, more than just a friend. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, entered the room quietly, her footsteps barely audible on the polished wooden floor. She carried 2 cups of tea, steam rising gently from the delicate china. William didn't turn around immediately, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his breathing that only she would notice after years of marriage. "The car will be here in 20 minutes, she said softly, placing 1 cup on his desk. Her voice carried the same gentle strength that had supported him through countless public appearances and private struggles. William finally turned, and Catherine's heart ached at the sight of unshed tears in his eyes. This was the man who had stood stoically at his mother's funeral, who had served his country with unwavering dignity, now vulnerable in a way that few would ever see. "I don't know how to do this, Catherine," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you say goodbye to someone who taught you what it means to serve, what it means to put duty above everything else?" The someone was Colonel James Morrison, William's former commanding officer and longtime friend, who lay in the hospital fighting a battle he couldn't win. Morrison had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer 6 months earlier, and despite the best medical care money could provide, his condition had deteriorated rapidly. Catherine set down her own cup and moved closer to her husband. She had watched their relationship over the years, seen how Morrison had become not just a military superior, but a father figure to William. When William had struggled with the weight of his future crown, it was Morrison who had helped him find his path. When the pressures of royal life seemed overwhelming, Morrison was the one who reminded him of his purpose. "You don't say goodbye," Catherine said, reaching for William's hand. "You say thank you. You tell him what he means to you, what he's meant to our family, to our children. You let him know that his legacy will live on." Outside, the sounds of London morning traffic seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. William squeezed Catherine's hand, drawing strength from her presence. She had been his anchor through every storm, and today would be no different. The couple had met Morrison during William's military service, but Catherine's relationship with the colonel had developed independently. Morrison had been one of the few people who had seen past her commoner background to recognize her genuine character. He had been instrumental in helping her navigate the complex world of royal protocol while maintaining her authentic self. "Do you remember the first time he invited us to dinner at his home?" Catherine asked, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You were so nervous about me meeting him properly." William's expression softened at the memory. Morrison had lived in a modest cottage in the Cotswolds, a stark contrast to the grandeur of royal residences. That evening had been one of the most relaxed and genuine interactions Catherine had experienced since joining the royal family. Morrison's wife, Eleanor, had treated her like any other dinner guest, asking about her interests, her family, her hopes for the future. "He told me that night that you were special," William recalled. "He said you had the kind of strength that couldn't be taught or inherited." He was right. The memory brought both comfort and pain. Eleanor had passed away 2 years earlier, and Morrison's decline had accelerated after losing his beloved wife of 45 years. William and Catherine had visited him regularly, often bringing their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, who had grown to love the man they called Uncle James. A gentle knock at the door interrupted their quiet moment. It was their private secretary, announcing that the car had arrived. William straightened his shoulders, the transformation from vulnerable husband to composed prince happening before Catherine's eyes. But she could still see the grief he was trying to contain. As they prepared to leave, William picked up a small wooden box from his desk. Inside was a set of military medals that had belonged to his grandfather, along with a handwritten letter. It was something he had been working on for weeks, trying to find the right words to express what Morrison meant to him. The drive through London was unusually quiet. Normally, William and Catherine would discuss their schedule, review talking points for public appearances, or simply chat about their children. Today, they sat in contemplative silence, both lost in memories of the man they were going to see. Morrison had been there for every major milestone in their relationship. He had offered William advice before the proposal, been a calming presence on their wedding day, and had been among the first to visit when each of their children was born. His wisdom had guided William through some of the most challenging periods of his royal duties. The hospital came into view, a modern building that stood in stark contrast to the historic architecture they were accustomed to. As their car pulled up to a private entrance, Catherine could see the small crowd of media gathered at the main entrance. Word had somehow leaked about their visit, but their security team had arranged for a discreet arrival. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was hushed and sterile. The familiar sense of disinfectant and floor polish reminded Catherine of her own charitable visits to medical facilities. But this was different. This was personal. The corridor leading to Morrison's room seemed longer than it actually was, each step bringing them closer to a goodbye neither wanted to say. Dr. Sarah Chen, Morrison's primary physician, met them outside his room. She was a petite woman with kind eyes who had been keeping the royal couple updated on Morrison's condition throughout his treatment. "He's been asking about you both all morning," she said quietly. "He's weak, but his mind is clear. He wanted me to tell you that he's grateful you're here." William nodded, his jaw tight with emotion. Catherine placed a reassuring hand on his arm, a small gesture that had become their secret language over the years. Through the glass panel in the door, they could see Morrison lying in the hospital bed, looking smaller and frailer than either had ever seen him. Taking a deep breath, William pushed open the door, and they stepped inside to face one of the most difficult moments of their lives. The man who had been a pillar of strength for so many was now depending on them to be strong for him. It was a role reversal that neither had anticipated, but one they were prepared to embrace with the same grace and dignity that Morrison had taught them. Colonel Morrison's eyes lit up the moment William and Catherine entered his hospital room, despite the obvious pain etched across his weathered features. Even in his weakened state, he attempted to straighten up in bed, the military bearing that had defined his life still present in his movements. "None of that formal nonsense," Morrison said with a weak smile as William began to bow slightly. "We're well past protocol between us, aren't we?" Catherine felt her throat tighten at the familiar warmth in Morrison's voice. This was the same man who had taught her children to march in formation around his garden, who had patiently explained military history to young George, and who had always made Charlotte feel like the most important person in the room, with his undivided attention. William pulled up a chair close to the bed while Catherine settled into the window seat, the afternoon light casting a gentle glow across the room. Someone had brought fresh flowers, and Catherine recognized them as Morrison's favorites from his own garden, roses that Eleanor had planted years ago. "How are the children?" Morrison asked, his voice hoarse but filled with genuine interest. Even facing his final days, his thoughts turned to others, a characteristic that had made him beloved by everyone who knew him. "They wanted to come," Catherine replied, leaning forward. "George insisted on making you something." She reached into her bag and pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper. It was a drawing of Morrison in his military uniform, standing next to what was clearly meant to be Buckingham Palace, with stick figures of the royal family nearby. Morrison's eyes filled with tears as he studied the drawing. "He got the medals right," he whispered, touching the colorful scribbles that represented his decorations. "Smart boy, that one. He'll make a fine king someday with proper guidance." The weight of those words settled over William. Morrison had been instrumental in teaching him about the balance between duty and humanity, about leading with both strength and compassion. The lessons had come not through formal instruction, but through example, through watching how Morrison treated everyone from high-ranking officials to hospital janitors with the same respect and dignity. "I brought you something," William said, producing the wooden box he had carried from the palace. "These were my grandfather's. I thought you should have them." Morrison's hand shook slightly as he opened the box. Inside, nestled in velvet, were 3 military medals, including one for distinguished service during World War II. Accompanying them was William's letter, sealed, but with Morrison's name written in William's careful handwriting. "I can't accept these," Morrison protested, though his fingers traced the edges of the medals reverently. "These belong to your family." "You are family," William said firmly. "You've been more of a father to me than many men are lucky enough to have. These medals represent service, sacrifice, and honor. There's no one more deserving." Catherine watched the exchange, remembering all the times Morrison had been there for them. When William had struggled with anxiety about his royal duties, Morrison had shared stories of his own fears before major military operations. When Catherine had felt overwhelmed by media attention, Morrison had taught her techniques he had used to stay calm under pressure in combat situations. "Do you remember when George was born?" Catherine asked softly. "You drove through that terrible storm to get to the hospital. The staff said you waited in the corridor for 6 hours just to make sure everything was all right." Morrison chuckled, a sound that quickly turned into a cough. "Couldn't sleep anyway. Eleanor was beside herself with worry, kept pacing around the house. I figured I might as well pace somewhere useful." The mention of Eleanor brought a moment of silence. Morrison's love for his wife had been legendary among those who knew them. They had met during his first deployment, married 6 months later, and had been inseparable for 4 decades. Her death had left a void that even his love for his adopted royal family couldn't completely fill. "She's waiting for me," Morrison said quietly, as if reading their thoughts. "I dream about her every night now. She's always standing in that garden of hers, wearing that blue dress she loved so much. She tells me not to worry about leaving you all behind, says you're stronger than you know." William reached for Morrison's hand, no longer caring about maintaining any semblance of royal composure. "We're not ready to let you go." "None of us ever are," Morrison replied. "But that's not really how life works, is it? The important thing is what we leave behind, what we've built together. And you two, your children, the work you're doing, that's a legacy worth being proud of." Over the next hour, they talked about everything and nothing. Morrison shared stories from his military days, tales that had been refined over years of telling but never lost their power to inspire. He spoke about his hopes for George, Charlotte, and Louis, about the kind of leaders he believed they could become. He offered gentle advice about navigating the challenges that lay ahead for William and Catherine. "The world is changing faster than ever," Morrison said, his voice growing weaker but his message urgent. "The monarchy will need to change with it, but not at the expense of what makes it valuable. Remember that your strength comes from your connection to the people, not your distance from them." Catherine nodded, thinking of the countless hours they had spent discussing this very topic. Morrison had been one of the few people who understood the delicate balance between tradition and evolution that the royal family constantly navigated. A nurse entered quietly to check Morrison's vital signs, and the interruption served as a reminder of why they were there. Time was running short, and there were things that needed to be said. "I need you to promise me something," Morrison said when they were alone again. Don't let my passing become about me. Use it to highlight the work, the causes we've all supported together, the veterans who need help, the military families struggling with deployment. Make my goodbye count for something. It was so typical of Morrison to think of others even in his final hours. William and Catherine exchanged a look, both understanding immediately what he was asking. Their goodbye would indeed be public, but they would ensure it served a greater purpose. There's something else, Morrison continued, reaching for the sealed letter William had brought. I wrote something for each of the children. Would you make sure they get them when the time is right? Catherine accepted the 3 smaller envelopes that Morrison produced from his bedside table, each one labeled in his careful script with the names of their children. The weight of the responsibility felt enormous, but she knew it was also an honor. As the afternoon wore on, Morrison grew visibly tired, but he seemed reluctant to let them go. They were all aware that this might be their final conversation, that the next time they saw him, he might not be conscious. The unspoken knowledge hung in the air between them like a third presence in the room. I want you to know, Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper, that watching you two grow into the people you've become, seeing your children take their first steps into this world, it's been the greatest privilege of my life, greater than any medal, any commendation, any recognition I've ever received. William felt tears rolling down his cheeks, no longer caring who might see his emotion. Catherine moved from the window seat to stand beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder as they both struggled to process the magnitude of what they were losing. Outside the hospital window, London continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in this quiet room, a chapter was ending in the lives of some of its most visible residents. The setting sun cast long shadows across the floor, marking the passage of time that had suddenly become so precious and so finite. The call came at dawn 3 days later. William was in his study preparing for a scheduled meeting about veteran affairs when his private phone rang. Catherine was still sleeping, exhausted from a late-night engagement the previous evening. The caller ID showed Dr. Chen's number, and William knew immediately what the call would bring. He passed peacefully in his sleep about an hour ago, Dr. Chen said gently. He wasn't in any pain. The nurse on duty said he seemed to be smiling. William thanked the doctor and ended the call, then sat in silence for several minutes. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed different somehow, as if the world itself had shifted slightly off its axis. He knew he needed to wake Catherine, needed to call the children's nanny to prepare them, needed to begin the formal process of announcing Morrison's death. But for just a moment, he allowed himself to simply grieve. Catherine found him there 20 minutes later, still sitting in the same position. She didn't need to ask what had happened. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the careful way he was holding himself together. When? She asked simply, moving to stand behind his chair and placing her hands on his shoulders. About an hour ago. Peacefully, the doctor said. They held each other in the quiet of the morning, both remembering their last conversation with Morrison, both grateful they had been able to say goodbye properly. After a few minutes, Catherine pulled back to look at her husband. What do you need from me today? She asked. It was a question she had learned to ask during difficult times, understanding that sometimes William needed space to process, and sometimes he needed her partnership in facing the world. Help me tell the children, William said, and then help me figure out how to honor his memory the way he wanted. Breaking the news to George, Charlotte, and Louis proved to be one of the most difficult conversations of William and Catherine's parenting journey. George, at 10 years old, understood death intellectually but struggled with the emotional reality. Charlotte cried openly, remembering how Uncle James had taught her to identify different types of flowers in his garden. Louis, the youngest, seemed confused about why Uncle James wouldn't be coming to visit anymore. Will we see him again? Charlotte asked through her tears. Catherine knelt down to her daughter's level. "Not in the way we're used to seeing him," she said carefully. "But Uncle James believed that the people we love never really leave us. They live on in our memories, in the things they taught us, in the way they made us feel loved." The formal announcement of Morrison's death was released that afternoon, accompanied by a personal statement from William and Catherine that struck a chord with people across the nation and beyond. Rather than focusing on Morrison's military achievements or his connection to the royal family, the statement highlighted his character, his dedication to service, and his impact on those who knew him. Within hours, tributes began pouring in from unexpected sources. Former soldiers who had served under Morrison shared stories of his leadership and compassion. Charity workers from organizations he had supported quietly for years came forward with tales of his generosity. Hospital staff from the facility where he had spent his final days spoke about his kindness to other patients and their families. The public response was overwhelming. Flowers began appearing at the gates of Kensington Palace, along with handwritten notes from people who had never met Morrison, but had been touched by his story. Veterans organizations announced plans for memorial services. The government offered a state funeral, which William and Catherine politely declined, knowing Morrison would have preferred something simpler. Instead, they worked with Morrison's remaining family members to plan a service that would reflect his values and wishes. The ceremony would be held at the small church near his cottage in the Cotswolds, the same church where he and Eleanor had been married, where they had worshipped together for decades. Planning the service became a way for William and Catherine to process their grief while honoring Morrison's final request. They reached out to the military charities he had supported, inviting them to participate in a way that would raise awareness for their work. They arranged for a collection in lieu of flowers, directing donations to organizations supporting military families. The night before the funeral, William sat down to write his eulogy. He had delivered countless speeches over the years, but this felt different. This wasn't about duty or protocol. This was about love, loss, and the kind of relationship that transcended titles and positions. Catherine found him at his desk near midnight, surrounded by crumpled papers. Writing about Morrison, about what he had meant to their family, seemed to require a new kind of honesty, a vulnerability that didn't come easily to someone trained in royal reserve. "Tell me your favorite memory of him," Catherine said, settling into the chair across from his desk. William looked up, his eyes tired but thoughtful. "It was about 6 months after we were married. I was struggling with a particularly difficult situation involving the press, feeling like nothing I did was right. Morrison called and asked if I wanted to go fishing. We spent the entire day on this little stream near his house, not catching anything, just talking. He told me that leadership wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about learning from them and keeping moving forward." Catherine smiled. "He told me once that the best leaders are the ones who doubt themselves sometimes, because it means they care enough to question whether they're doing the right thing." The eulogy that William ultimately delivered was unlike any speech he had given before. Standing in the small church, looking out at a congregation that included everyone from high-ranking military officials to Morrison's elderly neighbors, he spoke about mentorship, about the way one person's integrity could ripple outward to touch countless lives. "Colonel Morrison taught me that duty and love are not opposing forces," William said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "He showed me that serving others doesn't mean sacrificing your humanity. It means embracing it more fully. He lived his life as proof that strength comes not from never showing vulnerability, but from choosing to care deeply despite the risks." The service itself was beautiful and deeply moving. Musicians from Morrison's former regiment played traditional military hymns alongside Eleanor's favorite classical pieces. Colleagues shared stories that revealed different facets of Morrison's character. The local vicar spoke about Morrison's quiet faith and his dedication to his community. Catherine delivered a reading that Morrison had specifically requested, a poem by Rudyard Kipling that had been read at Eleanor's funeral. Her voice remained steady throughout, though those who knew her well could see the emotion she was holding in check. The most powerful moment came when George, Charlotte, and Louis stepped forward together to place a wreath they had made themselves at the altar. They had spent hours the previous day selecting flowers from the palace gardens, choosing varieties that Morrison had taught them to identify. The sight of the three young royals honoring their surrogate grandfather moved many in the congregation to tears. After the service, the reception was held in the parish hall, a modest space that somehow perfectly captured Morrison's unpretentious nature. William and Catherine moved through the crowd, speaking with everyone from Morrison's military colleagues to his postmen, treating each conversation with equal importance. An elderly woman approached Catherine near the end of the reception. She introduced herself as Morrison's next-door neighbor and shared a story that Catherine would remember for years to come. "He used to help me with my garden," the woman said. "Never made a fuss about it, just appeared every week with his pruning shears. When I tried to thank him, he always said the same thing. We're all just here to help each other along the way." That's how he saw life, I think. Just helping people along their way. The drive back to London was quiet, the children exhausted from the emotional day and asleep in their car seats. William and Catherine sat in contemplative silence, both processing what had been a deeply meaningful but painful experience. "He would have loved today," Catherine said finally. "The church full of people, everyone sharing stories about him, the children participating. It felt like him." William nodded. "I keep thinking about what he said about making our goodbye count for something. Today felt like the beginning of that." Indeed, the impact of Morrison's story and the way William and Catherine had chosen to honor him continued long after the funeral. The charities he had supported saw significant increases in donations and volunteer applications. Military families reached out to share their own stories, inspired by the example of someone who had dedicated his life to service. More importantly, Morrison's influence on William and Catherine became visible in subtle but significant ways. Their approach to public engagements became more personal, more focused on genuine connection rather than mere duty. They spoke more openly about the challenges of balancing public service with family life, sharing the kind of authentic humanity that Morrison had always encouraged. 6 months later, William and Catherine established the Morrison Foundation, dedicated to supporting military families and veterans' mental health services. The announcement was made during a visit to Morrison's former regiment, where William spoke about the ongoing nature of Morrison's influence on their lives. Colonel Morrison believed that the true measure of a life well lived is not in the accolades received, but in the lives touched along the way, William said to the assembled service members. His greatest achievement was not any medal or commendation, but the countless people he inspired to be better versions of themselves. The Foundation's first project was a series of family support centers near military bases, designed to provide resources for spouses and children during deployments. Catherine took particular interest in the mental health components, remembering Morrison's insights into the hidden struggles that military families often face. On the first anniversary of Morrison's death, William and Catherine returned to the small church in the Cotswolds for a private memorial service. They brought the children, who had each written letters to Uncle James that they left at his gravesite alongside Eleanor's. The letters contained updates about school, friends, and the things they had learned in the past year that they thought he would find interesting. Standing in the churchyard as the sun set over the English countryside, William reflected on how much had changed in the year since Morrison's death. The grief had evolved from sharp pain to a gentler sadness, mixed now with gratitude for the time they had shared and the lessons that continued to guide their lives. "He was right about us being stronger than we knew," Catherine said, echoing Morrison's final words to them. But I think what he really taught us was that strength doesn't mean going it alone. It means knowing when to lean on each other, when to ask for help, when to let people see that you're human. As they walked back to their car, George ran ahead to open the gate, demonstrating the same considerate nature that Morrison had always noticed and encouraged. Charlotte stopped to pick flowers for her mother, remembering the gardening lessons Uncle James had patiently given her. Lewis held tight to William's hand, secure in the love that surrounded him. The farewell that had moved a nation continued to resonate, not because of its drama or publicity, but because of its authenticity. In choosing to grieve publicly and honor Morrison's memory through continued service, William and Catherine had demonstrated that even those born to privilege and duty were fundamentally human, capable of deep love and profound loss. Morrison's legacy lived on not just in the foundation that bore his name or the charities he had supported, but in the daily choices made by the family he had helped to shape. His influence could be seen in William's increased openness about mental health struggles, in Catherine's advocacy for military families, and in the way their children were being raised to understand that privilege comes with responsibility. The nation that had been moved by their farewell continued to be inspired by the way they transformed their grief into purpose, their loss into a legacy of service that Morrison himself would have been proud to claim.